Picture a Sunday afternoon in 1963. The smell of roast beef drifts through a terraced house in Manchester, mingling with the ever-present haze of embassy cigarette smoke. A toddler sits on the living room floor, playing with a toy made of lead paint and sharp metal edges, whilst his older brother, aged 7, has been out for the past 3 hours, playing somewhere in the neighborhood. No one knows exactly where. No one is particularly worried. The transistor radio crackles with the light program, and through the net curtains you can see other children, some barely 5 years old, crossing busy roads alone, riding bicycles without helmets, building precarious rope swings over concrete. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't carelessness. This was simply parenting in 1960s Britain. Today, we're going to explore 15 perfectly normal, everyday parenting practices from that era that would, quite genuinely, have social services knocking at your door and possibly see you facing criminal charges in modern Britain. Number 15. Leaving your baby outside in the pram to nap, regardless of the weather. This wasn't an occasional thing. This was doctrine. Health visitors, those stern women in Navy uniforms who came round to inspect your housekeeping and your mothering skills, actively encouraged it. Fresh air was considered essential for infant health, almost medicinal in its properties. So out went the pram, onto the front step, into the garden, or even on the pavement outside a shop, whilst mother popped in for groceries. The baby would be wrapped in blankets, perhaps with a knitted bonnet, but the pram would sit there, often in temperatures that would make your teeth chatter. You'd see rows of prams outside doctors' surgeries, outside the butchers, lined up like cars outside a pub. No one thought twice about it. The cold, pink-cheeked baby sleeping peacefully under layers of wool wasn't suffering. They were thriving according to the wisdom of the day, building up their constitution, their resistance to illness. Try that today. Leave your baby outside Tesco for 5 minutes whilst you grab a pint of milk and see how long it takes for someone to call the police. You'd be looking at charges of child neglect, possibly child endangerment. The pram that was once a symbol of responsible parenting, airing your child properly, has become evidence of abandonment. What was health advice has become a crime scene. Number 14. Letting your children play in the street, entirely unsupervised, from morning until dark. The street was the playground. It wasn't a traffic route that occasionally had children in it. It was where childhood happened. Boys would play football with jumpers for goalposts, right there on the tarmac. Girls would skip rope from one pavement to the other, the rope slapping against the road in rhythm. Children as young as 4 or 5 would be out there, their mothers shouting from doorways when tea was ready, but otherwise leaving them to their own devices for hours. No mobile phones, obviously, no way to check in. If you got hurt, you'd come home crying, and you'd likely be told to stop making a fuss. If you were hungry, you'd come in and make yourself a jam sandwich. The concept of constant adult supervision simply didn't exist. Parents weren't watching from windows. They were getting on with housework, or having a cup of tea, or reading the paper. The danger, of course, was very real. Cars did come down those streets, usually slowly, drivers expecting children to dart out. But accidents happened. Broken bones were common. Yet the freedom, the sheer scope of it, was considered essential to growing up. Today, if you told your 6-year-old to go out and play in the street and not come back until dinner and someone reported it, you'd face immediate intervention from social services. The charge would be neglect, failure to provide adequate supervision. What was once the very definition of a normal childhood, that independence, that risk, that scraped knee earned on your own terms, is now classified as putting a child at unacceptable risk. The street that raised a generation is now off-limits without an adult escort. Number 13. Smoking constantly around your children, indoors, in the car, everywhere. It wasn't just that people smoked in the 60s, it was that they smoked everywhere, all the time, with no thought whatsoever for the children breathing the same air. Your father smoked at the dinner table, ash dropping into the ashtray beside his plate of mince and potatoes. Your mother smoked whilst cooking, whilst bathing you, whilst tucking you into bed. They smoked in the car with all the windows rolled up in winter, the interior thick with blue-gray fog. Doctors smoked in their surgeries whilst examining children. Teachers smoked in the staff room between lessons, and the smell clung to their cardigans when they returned to class. It wasn't considered harmful to children. That knowledge, that connection between secondhand smoke and respiratory problems, asthma, increased cancer risk, hadn't yet become common understanding. The cigarette was as much a part of the domestic landscape as the kettle or the wireless. You simply grew up with it, your clothes perpetually smelling of tobacco, your lungs adapting as best they could. Now, try lighting up a cigarette in a car with a child present in England or Wales. Since 2015, it's been illegal. The fine is £50. Smoking in your own car, that private space, becomes a criminal offense if a child is there. Smoke persistently around your children in your home, fill their rooms with it day after day, and it can be cited as evidence of neglect in family court proceedings. What was once universal, unremarkable, as normal as breathing, is now something that can see you prosecuted or have your children removed. The cigarette that punctuated every moment of 60s life has become a symbol of child abuse. Number 12. Never using car seats, seat belts, or any restraints for children in vehicles. The family car in the 60s, if you were fortunate enough to have one, was a mobile playground for children. There were no car seats. Seat belts themselves only became compulsory in the front seats in 1983 and in the back seats in 1991. Before that, children would roam freely in the back of a Morris Minor or a Ford Anglia. Babies sat on laps in the front passenger seat. Toddlers stood on the back seat, faces pressed against the rear window, waving at cars behind. Older children might lie down in the back for long journeys or sit in the boot space of an estate car, facing backwards, treating it like their own little compartment. If you braked suddenly, everyone lurched forward. If you took a corner too fast, children tumbled into each other laughing. It was part of the adventure of car travel. No one wore helmets, obviously. No one was strapped in. The idea of a purpose-built child car seat with its complex harness and rigid frame would have seemed absurd, overprotective, perhaps even dangerous in itself. What if there was an accident and the child was trapped? This was genuinely how people thought. The freedom of movement inside the car was considered normal, and the risk of serious injury in an accident, whilst acknowledged on some level, wasn't something that translated into action, into restraint. Today, the law is absolutely clear and strictly enforced. Children must use the correct car seat for their age, height, and weight until they're 12 years old or 135 centimeters tall. Not using a proper car seat is an offense. The driver can be fined up to 500 pounds. Put your baby in your lap in the front seat. Let your toddler stand up in the back, and you're not just breaking the law. You're committing an act that's seen as so dangerous, so reckless, that it would almost certainly result in prosecution and could be used as evidence of broader neglect. The car that was once a space of chaotic freedom has become one of the most regulated environments in a child's life. Number 11. Sending children to the shops alone, often at very young ages, sometimes with a note for cigarettes or alcohol. The corner shop was a child's first taste of independence and responsibility. From about age 5 or 6, you'd be sent on errands. Your mother would give you a few coins, perhaps a written note, and off you'd go down the street, round the corner to fetch a loaf of bread, a pint of milk, or 20 Embassy filter. Yes, cigarettes. The shopkeeper wouldn't question it. The note in your mother's handwriting was proof enough that this was a legitimate purchase, not a child trying to buy tobacco for themselves. Or perhaps there was no note, and the shopkeeper simply knew you, knew your family, knew that you were running an errand. The same applied to alcohol. A child might be sent to the off-license with a jug to be filled with beer, or to buy a bottle of sherry for Sunday dinner. It wasn't illegal to sell these things to a child who was clearly purchasing them on behalf of an adult. It was simply how things worked. The transaction was quick, and you'd walk home carefully, the glass bottles clinking in your shopping bag, feeling terribly grown up and useful. Try that today. Send your 7-year-old to the co-op with a note asking for 20 Benson & Hedges, and you'll have the police involved before the child even reaches the shop door. It's now illegal for anyone under 18 to purchase tobacco or alcohol, note or no note, and any adult facilitating such a purchase, which sending a child would constitute, is committing an offense. The shopkeeper who once served you without question would now be breaking multiple laws. The errand that built confidence and taught responsibility has become an act of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, a criminal matter. The corner shop that was your training ground for adulthood is now a place you can't access alone until you're nearly grown. Number 10, giving children alcohol, quite openly and without any sense of wrongdoing. This wasn't about sneaking your teenager a beer. This was routine, casual, and started young. A small glass of Advocate at Christmas, thick and yellow and sickly sweet, given to children as young as 5 or 6. A shandy in the beer garden of a pub on a Sunday afternoon, the lemonade barely diluting the bitter. A sip of your father's Guinness to put hairs on your chest, the dark liquid bitter and strange on a child's tongue. A spoonful of brandy and warm milk to help you sleep when you had a cold. These weren't seen as giving children alcohol in any problematic sense. They were seen as treats, as medicine, as simply part of life. No one thought about liver development or the impact of alcohol on a growing brain. The drinks were weak, the quantities small, and the setting was home, supervised by parents, so where was the harm? Pubs were family spaces on weekends. Children sat outside with crisps and lemonade, but sometimes that lemonade had a splash of something stronger, and no one batted an eyelid. It was normal. It was how you learned to handle drink responsibly by being introduced to it gradually in a controlled setting. That was the theory anyway. Now the law is clear. It's illegal to give alcohol to a child under 5 anywhere. For children aged 5 to 17, you can give them alcohol at home or on private premises, but not in licensed premises. But even giving alcohol to your own children at home, if done frequently or in quantities that affect their well-being, can be classified as neglect. Social services can and do intervene. What's more, the social stigma has completely shifted. The parent who gives their 10-year-old a shandy at a family barbecue would be judged harshly by other parents, might find themselves reported. What was once a rite of passage, a small, sweet drink at a celebration, has become evidence of failing to protect your child from harm. Number 9, using corporal punishment freely and publicly, with full social approval. Smacking wasn't just allowed in 60s Britain, it was expected. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't just a saying, it was parenting philosophy. Children were smacked for disobedience, for cheekiness, for not finishing their dinner, for tracking mud through the house. A slap on the legs, a smack on the bottom, a clip round the ear. These were standard punishments, delivered without guilt and often in public. Your mother might smack you in the middle of the high street if you threw a tantrum. Your father might take his belt to you for a serious transgression. Teachers used the cane at school, and when you got home and told your parents you'd been caned, you'd likely get another smack for whatever you'd done to deserve it in the first place. There was no contradiction seen in hitting a child to teach them not to hit others. It was discipline. It was how respect was instilled. It was quick, it was clear, and the child knew exactly what they'd done wrong. The sting of the smack was the consequence, immediate and physical. Most adults today who grew up in the 60s will say, "It never did me any harm." But times have changed, and so has the law. In Scotland, since 2020, it's been illegal to smack your child at all. In England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, reasonable chastisement is still technically a defense. But what counts as reasonable has become so narrowly defined that anything leaving a mark, anything done with an implement, anything to the head is assault. And even a smack that leaves no mark can be prosecuted depending on the circumstances. Do it in public, and you'll almost certainly have police called. Do it repeatedly, and it's child abuse. What was once the cornerstone of discipline, so common that every child knew its sting, is now something that can see you in court, see you losing custody of your children. The smack that never did any harm is now classified as violence. Number 8, leaving children alone at home for hours from quite young ages. Latchkey children, they were called. Children who came home from school to an empty house because both parents worked, or more commonly, because mother was out at her part-time job or visiting a neighbor. From about age 7 or 8, you'd have your own key on a piece of string round your neck. You'd let yourself in, make yourself a cup of squash and a sandwich, and settle in front of the telly or go out to play until your parents came home. Younger siblings might be left in the care of a child only a few years older. An 11-year-old minding a 6-year-old and a toddler for 3 or 4 hours wasn't unusual. You'd be given instructions, perhaps a shilling to go to the chippy if parents were going to be very late. And that was it. You'd manage. If there was an emergency, you'd go to a neighbor, but emergencies were rare, and you'd muddle through. There was a sense of trust, both in the child's capability and in the relative safety of the world. Doors were often left unlocked. Neighbors kept an eye out, in a general sense. But the idea that a child couldn't be left alone, that they needed constant adult supervision even in their own home, simply didn't exist. Today, there's no specific law stating the age at which you can leave a child alone, but there might as well be. The NSPCC guidelines suggest no child under 12 should be left alone for long periods, and children under 16 shouldn't be left alone overnight. But more than guidelines, there's the reality of prosecution. If you leave a young child alone and something goes wrong, even if nothing serious happens but a neighbor reports it, you can be charged with neglect. Parents have been prosecuted for leaving children as old as 10 or 11 at home whilst they popped to the shops. What was once a mark of growing up, that front door key, and the trust it represented, is now potential evidence of abandonment. The latchkey child who learned self-reliance has become a victim in need of rescue. Number 7. Allowing children to play with genuinely dangerous toys and in genuinely dangerous ways. The toys of the 60s were not safety tested in any meaningful sense. Chemistry sets came with real chemicals, substances you could actually make stink bombs or small explosions with, along with a Bunsen burner and no adult supervision assumed. Lawn darts, those heavy, pointed projectiles, were thrown high into the air in the garden, coming down with enough force to impale. Children played with them. Archery sets with real arrows, cap guns that looked entirely real and could burn your fingers, metal toys with sharp edges, small parts that were choking hazards, and paint that contained lead. Plastics hadn't taken over yet, so most toys were wood or metal, heavy and hard and perfectly capable of inflicting injury. Then there were the games children invented themselves, building rope swings over brick walls or concrete playgrounds, the rope tied to a tree branch that might or might not hold, jumping off garage roofs into piles of leaves or cardboard boxes, playing chicken on railway lines, seeing who could stand closest to the tracks as a train approached. These weren't rare acts of delinquency. These were childhood pastimes. Adults might tell you off if they caught you, but the expectation was that you'd learn your limits through experience, which sometimes meant through injury. A broken arm was a story to tell, a badge of honor. The danger was part of the fun. Now, toys are so heavily regulated that a chemistry set for children is barely more than mixing food coloring with baking soda. Lawn darts have been banned in multiple countries after causing deaths. Any toy sold must meet rigorous safety standards, be tested for small parts, sharp edges, toxic materials. But beyond the toys themselves, the supervision has changed. Allow your child to build a rope swing over concrete without adult supervision. Let them jump off structures, play near railway lines, and you're not letting them have a 60s childhood. You're neglecting their safety. If they're injured doing these things because you allowed it or weren't supervising, you can face criminal charges. What was once the raw material of adventure is now evidence of parental failure. Number 6. Taking children to the pub regularly, where they'd sit for hours in smoke-filled rooms. The pub was a family destination. On a Sunday lunchtime, after church or instead of church, families would go to the local. The children would sit outside in the beer garden if the weather was fine, with packets of crisps and bottles of Tizer, whilst the adults drank inside. But if it was cold or wet, the children came inside too. They'd sit in the corner of the saloon bar, on hard wooden benches, surrounded by adults drinking and smoking, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of beer. A coal fire might be burning in the grate. The noise was loud, voices raised over each other, laughter, sometimes arguments. Children would sit quietly, ideally not causing trouble, sipping their lemonade, occasionally being given a packet of pork scratchings or a pickled egg from the bar. Hours would pass. Your father would have his pints, your mother her port and lemon, and you'd wait. If you complained of boredom, you'd be told to amuse yourself or given a pencil and the back of a beer mat to draw on. No one questioned it. The pub was a social hub, and children were part of that social fabric, even if they were expected to be seen and not heard. Now, children are technically allowed in pubs, but the culture has completely changed. Most modern pubs that are child-friendly have separate family areas, serve food, and are essentially restaurants that happen to have a bar. The traditional spit and sawdust pub, smoky and loud, is largely gone. But even if it existed, taking your children there for hours regularly would raise eyebrows. Since the smoking ban in 2007, that particular element has vanished, but the idea of children sitting in a drinking establishment for hours whilst parents drink is now seen as inappropriate. Social Services guidance mentions exposure to alcohol misuse as a safeguarding concern. If you're regularly drinking in a pub with your children there for extended periods, and it affects their well-being, their schooling, their routine, it can be flagged. What was once a normal weekend activity, the family at the pub, has become something questionable, something that suggests your priorities might not be in order. Number 5, putting children to bed with hot water bottles filled with boiling water or using electric blankets with frayed cords. Keeping warm in a 60s house was a constant challenge. Central heating was rare and expensive. Most homes had one fire in the living room, and the rest of the house was cold. Bedrooms were freezing in winter, your breath visible in the air. So before bed, children were sent up with a hot water bottle. These were thick rubber, filled from a boiling kettle, screwed shut, and placed under the blankets to warm the bed. They were searingly hot. You'd be told not to touch it directly, to leave it at your feet. But in the night, in your sleep, you might roll onto it or hug it, and burns were common. Red welts on legs, blisters on feet. It was just one of those things. The alternative was freezing, so you took the risk. Electric blankets were another solution, but they were old, the wiring questionable. Cords would fray, insulation would crack, but they'd still be used, sometimes left on all night, which even then was known to be risky, but the cold was the more immediate enemy. House fires started this way. Electrocutions happened, but it was a calculated risk, the danger of warmth versus the certainty of cold. Today, hot water bottles are still sold, but they come with extensive safety warnings, and you're told never to fill them with boiling water, to use hot but not boiling water, and to check them regularly for perishing. Giving a child a boiling hot water bottle that causes burns would be seen as neglectful. Electric blankets must meet modern safety standards, and leaving an old, frayed one on a child's bed would be classified as dangerous. If a child was repeatedly burned by hot water bottles, or if you continued using unsafe electrical equipment around children after being warned, it could be considered willful neglect, a failure to provide a safe home environment. The warmth that made winter bearable has become a hazard that can see you prosecuted. Number 4, letting children roam freely for miles, across fields, through woods, along railway embankments, with no means of contact. This was perhaps the defining feature of a 60s childhood, that radical freedom. From about age 6 or 7, you'd leave the house in the morning during school holidays, and not be expected back until lunchtime or even dinner. You didn't tell your parents where you were going, not specifically. Out to play was sufficient. You'd roam with friends, building dens in woods, exploring derelict buildings, climbing trees, wading in streams, walking along railway embankments to see where the tracks went. You'd be miles from home, far beyond shouting distance, completely out of contact. If you were hurt, You'd have to make your own way back or rely on the kindness of strangers. If you got lost, you'd ask for directions or figure it out. The world was your playground, and the boundaries were essentially how far your legs could carry you before you needed to be home. Parents didn't worry, or if they did, they accepted it as the price of childhood. You couldn't wrap children in cotton wool. They needed to learn independence, to take risks, to have adventures. This was how you grew up sturdy, how you learned common sense. And mostly children came home safe, with scraped knees and torn clothes and stories to tell. Now this would be seen as outrageous neglect. A 6-year-old walking alone through woods miles from home with no phone, no way of being contacted, no adult knowing their location, would trigger immediate police involvement if spotted. The parents would face intense scrutiny. Were the children in danger? Were they being supervised? Did the parents care where they were? The modern expectation is that you know where your child is at all times, that you can contact them, that they're supervised, or at least in designated safe areas. Letting them roam freely, as was once the very essence of childhood freedom, is now a safeguarding issue. What built independence and resilience is now evidence of abandonment. Number 3. Having children do genuinely hard, sometimes dangerous work, both at home and for money. Children worked in the 60s, and not just little chores. By age 10 or 11, boys would have paper rounds, getting up at 5 in the morning to sort newspapers and deliver them in all weathers, lifting heavy bags, cycling through dark streets. Girls might work in shops on Saturdays or babysit for neighbors for hours, looking after multiple young children, including babies, with full responsibility. At home, children did heavy chores. They'd chop wood, carry coal, scrub floors, do laundry by hand in a tub with a washboard, look after younger siblings for long periods, cook entire meals on gas stoves or ranges. An 11-year-old might be in charge of getting tea ready for the family, boiling potatoes, frying sausages, managing naked flames and hot pans. It wasn't seen as child labor. It was helping the family, learning responsibility, earning your keep, or earning pocket money. The work was real, the risks were real, but the expectation was that children were capable, that they'd rise to the challenge. And they did, because there was no alternative. Today there are strict laws about child employment. Children under 13 can't work at all in most circumstances. Children aged 13 to 16 can only work limited hours, not during school, not before 7 in the morning or after 7 in the evening, and only in safe, light jobs. Paper rounds, shop work, these are still legal, but heavily regulated. But having your 10-year-old doing heavy household labor, managing cooking alone with all its burn risks, being fully responsible for younger siblings for extended periods, using dangerous tools, this would raise serious concerns. If a child was injured doing these tasks, if they were missing school to do them, if the work was excessive, social services would intervene. What was once valuable training, a way to contribute to the family and learn life skills, is now potential exploitation, potential neglect. The child who learned to cook a meal at 8 is now seen as a child at risk. Number 2, showing complete indifference to sun safety, allowing children to burn severely and repeatedly. The 60s, when the sun actually appeared in Britain, were a time of enthusiastic but completely unprotected sun exposure. Sunscreen existed, but it was rarely used, and the idea that children needed protection from the sun was largely absent. On a beach holiday, which might be a week in Blackpool or Margate if you were lucky, children would spend entire days on the sand with no sun cream, no hats, no shade. They'd go bright red, the kind of burn that hurt to touch, that made you feel sick, that meant you couldn't sleep that night because the sheets hurt against your skin. This was called catching the sun, and whilst it was acknowledged as painful, it wasn't seen as dangerous. It was just something that happened. Your skin would peel days later, coming off in satisfying sheets, and underneath would be a tan, or at least less painful skin. The cycle would repeat the next day. No one talked about skin cancer, about UV damage, about the long-term effects of repeated severe burns in childhood. A tan was healthy, a sign you'd had fresh air and exercise. Pale skin suggested you'd been cooped up indoors, which was undesirable. So children burned year after year, summer after summer, and no one thought anything of it. Now the medical evidence is overwhelming. Childhood sunburn significantly increases the risk of melanoma later in life. Parents are told to cover children up, use high-factor sunscreen, avoid midday sun. If your child went to school with a severe sunburn, bright red and blistered, there would be questions. Was this neglect? Did you fail to protect your child from a known harm? If it happened repeatedly, if you refused to take basic precautions, it could be classified as medical neglect, a failure to safeguard your child's health. What was once a mark of a good summer, that red-faced, peeling child back from holiday, is now evidence that you didn't care enough to protect them. Number 1. Dosing children with medicines that would now be considered dangerous without medical supervision. The medicine cabinet in a 60s home was a collection of remedies that would horrify a modern pharmacist. Aspirin for children given routinely for any fever, headache, or pain, despite the risk of Ray's syndrome, which wasn't understood then. Cough syrups containing codeine, sometimes morphine derivatives, available over the counter, given to children to help them sleep or stop a persistent cough. Gripe water for babies, which contained alcohol, sometimes as much as 5%, along with dill oil and sodium bicarbonate. Syrup of figs, a powerful laxative, given to children who hadn't had a bowel movement in a day. Malt extract with cod liver oil, thick and dark and vile tasting, spooned into protesting mouths daily for vitamins. None of this required a prescription. None of it came with the extensive warnings we see today. Parents dosed their children based on advice passed down, on what the chemist suggested, on what had worked before. Dosages were approximate, often generous. A good spoonful of cough mixture might be far more than the recommended amount, but if it worked, if the child stopped coughing and slept, where was the harm? Some remedies were actively dangerous. Teething powders contained mercury. Worm tablets were given routinely, whether worms were present or not, just in case. The modern understanding of medication safety, of side effects, of overdose risks, of the developing bodies of children requiring different treatment, simply didn't exist in everyday practice. Now, giving a child aspirin under 16 is advised against, except in specific circumstances under medical supervision. Codeine is restricted, not to be given to children under 12 at all. Medications containing alcohol for babies are banned. The casual approach to medication, that spoonful of whatever was in the cupboard, would now be seen as reckless endangerment. If a child was harmed by inappropriate medication given by parents without medical advice, it would be criminal. What was once ordinary home care, treating common childhood ailments with whatever worked, is now something that can see you charged with poisoning your own child. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't the practices of neglectful parents or dysfunctional families. These were the absolute norms of British parenting in the 60s. Every single one of these things was standard, expected, universal. You'd be hard-pressed to find a child who didn't experience most or all of them. They weren't secrets. They were openly done, in full view of neighbors, doctors, teachers, the police. No one intervened because there was nothing to intervene in. This was simply how children were raised. And the remarkable thing is that most of those children survived. They grew up. They became the adults of today. But survival isn't the same as safety, and the fact that most turned out fine doesn't mean the risks weren't real. Some children didn't survive. Some were hurt, sometimes badly. Some carried scars, physical and psychological, from these practices. The 60s weren't a golden age of parenting. They were a time of enormous risk, taken casually, absorbed by children who had no choice, normalized by a society that hadn't yet learned or hadn't yet cared to learn about child development, trauma, long-term harm. What changed? Knowledge, primarily. Medical research revealed the dangers of secondhand smoke, of aspirin in children, of severe sunburn. Studies showed the psychological impact of corporal punishment, of neglect, of exposure to adult behaviors. Laws followed that knowledge, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The Children Act 1989 fundamentally changed the legal landscape, making the welfare of the child paramount, giving social services powers to intervene, creating the framework within which all these once normal practices became criminal. But beyond law and medicine, something else shifted. The culture changed. The idea of what children deserved, what they needed, what they had a right to, expanded. Childhood became recognized as a distinct phase requiring protection, not a period to be toughened through. Risk became something to be minimized, not character building. And perhaps most significantly, parenting became something public, open to judgment, where the standards were set not by individual families, but by society as a whole, enforceable by law. The parents of the 60s would be baffled, probably defensive, possibly angry if confronted with these modern judgments. They weren't monsters. They loved their children. They did what they thought was right, what everyone else was doing, what their own parents had done to them. They weren't trying to harm anyone. But intent doesn't erase harm, and the standards of one era don't excuse the practices when viewed through the lens of another. These weren't 15 quirky differences. These were 15 genuinely dangerous practices, and the fact they were normal doesn't make them acceptable in hindsight. It makes them a reminder of how much we didn't know, how much we've learned, and how the price of that learning was paid by children who had no say in the matter. The gulf between then and now isn't just about law or knowledge. It's about a fundamental reimagining of what we owe to the youngest and most vulnerable among us. And whilst we can look back with some nostalgia for the freedoms of that era, for the simplicity, for the lack of constant anxiety that seems to define modern parenting, we shouldn't mistake nostalgia for wisdom. The past wasn't better because it was freer. It was riskier, and some of those risks were entirely avoidable. What we've gained in safety, in protection, in careful attention to child welfare, matters more than what we've lost in freedom and innocence. The 60s childhood, viewed honestly, wasn't something to recreate. It was something to learn from, to move beyond, and to ensure that the mistakes made in good faith then aren't repeated, even in the name of nostalgia now.